I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of the Top 10 of the 2010s, a weekly series where I talk about some of my favorite movies of the decade by genre. And here we are, once again, every 3 weeks we start a new genre. We're going to be talking about now the best documentaries of the decade. Essentially how the series works is there's one video here where I give 5 honorable mentions, including my 10 to 7 picks of the top 10 documentaries of the decade. Next video is a video from my picks of 6 to 2. And then the final video is just a sole video on my favorite documentary of the decade. You know, we've already done action, adventure, romance, sci-fi, fantasy was of course last week. So I hope you're enjoying the videos, and comment below. Let me know some of your favorite in a particular genre. I'd love to hear that. But jumping into it, my first honorable mention, going in alphabetical order, is Cartel Land. This is a documentary as experience. What essentially documentaries have done this decade, aside from exponentially rise in popularity, is just technological advancements that allowed them to be a little bit more prolific and a little bit more relevant and have us enter into a lot of different experiences and roles that we may not have been able to before. I think Cartel Land is this because of lightweight cameras and things of that sort. We're able to actually have a guy go in with these gang members and document them and see that experience. And so in one way, it's just amazing from that perspective, that it's just hanging out and just seeing these cartel members. And just, you know, the beginning scene, for example, is these gang members with masks on, with AK-47s, and they're making meth in the background, and they're just interviewing him. And, you know, that's so much more interesting than just a traditional interview in a room. Just that sort of visual dynamic element is something that is worthwhile on its own, but I also think it does an interesting aspect by trying to gain a sort of macro view and a micro view of the sort of drug war and the issues that Mexico has had with the States and bringing drugs from Mexico to the States and how that impacts the different countries. So of course we get that macro perspective of what's it doing on sort of an economic level and the deaths and the fatalities that are involved, but then we also get it from a smaller level and seeing how the actual gang members and how they feel and their sort of perspective, and knowing that they're doing is wrong, but they're poor, so that they feel like this is the only way to survive and to survive in this sort of town that they're in and hopefully get a better chance to get out. And then of course we have the people who are against it in these communities, these revolutionary groups, which we also follow. But then are they able to do it? Will this cycle just repeat? There's some interesting moral questions as well. So having that sort of larger perspective and that smaller perspective was very unique from that angle. So it's one part sort of Goodfellas, but except now that it's a reality, now that it has this realism style filmmaking, and it's a documentary, we know this is real, it becomes scary more than it is enthralling, but also sort of a good documentation of what's happening in this time period, in this sort of area. This is a huge problem that's really affecting both countries. Then we have Into the Abyss, which is a true crime documentary like no other, directed by legendary documentarian and legendary filmmaker Werner Herzog, who also had other great documentaries this decade: Into the Inferno, Cave of Forgotten Dreams, Lo and Behold. So he's a legendary documentarian, but of course this is, I think, one of his best films in my opinion, but also one of his, I think, the best of the decade. But it's not a true crime movie like you'd see Tiger King or some of the other ones, where it's just a really interesting story and you don't know who did it and who's the murderer. Everything's very clear. We know who the murderer is. They've been sent to jail. The film's not really trying to convince you that maybe there's a underlying truth and that the case was botched or whatever. It's pretty sort of definitive. And the structure is very simple. It's just interviewing people. So what makes it interesting if it's not sort of an exciting Hitchcockian type thriller? Well, because it's a documentary about reflection, about seeing how these decisions made by these boys impact the victims of the murders, of the murderers themselves and their family members. We see interviews with fathers of the murderers who are also in jail. We see interviews of sisters and sister of the murdered and brother of the murdered, and sort of this sort of real human connection. And the larger theme has to do with the death penalty, and I think Werner does a good job by sort of explicitly stating that he is against the death penalty, and therefore sort of signaling to the audience and to the viewer that this is not a unbiased documentary, or that's not the attempt he's trying to make, that he has a bias and a slant. So sort of keeping that into mind, but also trying to keep it very pure and basic, just having those interviewers, just sort of asking sort of simple, curious questions we see the emotional impact that has really affected these people and these lives, and how this one event sort of spirals out and totally impacts all of these people, and how it drudges up so many sort of parts of themselves that they don't maybe want to reveal, and parts that are so sensitive and of course heartbreaking. So it's a very sad documentary, very melancholic in that sense. But few docs this decade really reach the emotional honesty of this movie. Like, the camera's not even there, and they're just sort of reflecting on the impacts that this had, and how it will sort of change these people's lives, even on this small scale. It has long-lasting effects. Then we have Lenny Cooke, which is a movie about a high school basketball player who was once ranked higher than LeBron James, Carmelo Anthony, and Amari Stoudemire. What happened to him? Because we know those names of LeBron James, but we don't know necessarily who Lenny Cooke is. Now, this is directed by the Safdie brothers, and I discovered the movie when I was sort of going back in their catalog after loving Good Time and then, of course, Uncut Gems last year. And the first half of the documentary is pretty conventional, pretty traditional, still entertaining, but trying to figure out what happened with this guy. Where was he at the time? There's footage of him, in high school, sort of people documenting him, seeing him as the next big thing, the next Kevin Garnett, and then sort of seeing what happened, what led the decisions down to that road, but mostly using sort of archival footage and other footage. But really the genius of the documentary, and why I think it works, is the second half, where Safdie brothers come in and they start to interview, 2013 Lenny Cooke, who's I think only about 30 years old, and sort of removed from those events. He's done his playing career in basketball. He did some stuff in Europe and overseas and in smaller leagues, and didn't make it to the NBA. And it's sort of seeing a guy who's young by traditional standards, but him sort of reflecting on what has been the peak of his life, and some of the regrets that he had, but also certain things we see how he's processing of how he sort of copes with what happened and why he sort of went down this road. And it was one part, not everybody makes it kind of a thing, but another part, just poor decision making on his behalf. This was also a small period of time in the NBA where you were allowed to go straight from high school into the NBA, which was sort of very controversial at its time, in terms of luring sort of these young men into the NBA without having maybe full acknowledgement of the consequences and how it's going to affect their life. And then there's this really heartbreaking, the whole documentary is very melancholy and kind of self-reflexive, and well, not self-reflexive, but similar to Into the Abyss in terms of reflection on the past, and self-reflexive for Lenny Cooke in that sense. But there's a great scene at the end, which is one of the best in terms of documentaries. I don't want to spoil it, but it's very sort of meta and very sort of confronting the issue head on, through some interesting technology, where it just allows for a really cathartic kind of reflection of both this duality of, yes, regretting what you're doing, but also sort of thinking about a life that was lost. And it's a sad documentary, but it's very emotionally engaging, and that's why I really connected to that. Then my next pick is Weiner. This is a documentary about a political campaign for Anthony Weiner and his bid to become the New York mayor. Before the documentaries came in, their sort of goal was to help and document Anthony Weiner's sort of rise back to prevalence. He had been removed, disgraced from his other political career previously because of sexual pictures of himself and sexting and sexual relations that he had sort of digitally online with other women across the country that have sort of come out. And this was sort of his sort of rise back up. And we see that for the first bit of the documentary, but of course he's running for New York mayor, so there's lots of publicity involved. And then it happens again. And then these pictures arise, then we sort of get more information of what he's been doing and when he stopped or when he actually started to do it again. So in one part, it's just a fascinating fly-in-the-wall documentary, similar to Cartel Land, where we get a unique perspective of this kind of a life, where we get a really backstage access, which we've seen another documentary that shows Bill Clinton's rise to power, but with success in the war room. The Weiner does a similar thing, except when we're seeing that rise to power, it strikes him again and we see him fall back down again in a lot of ways. It's a great narrative, just that happens by happenstance, which of course documentaries are great at capturing, and those are the best documentaries where you just are so, how did this stumble into this kind of a situation? The Queen of Versailles is another one of those where it's just a great situation. Well, it's a bad situation that happens, but great for the documentary. So on one hand, we see this really passionate guy who's interested in fighting for the working class, and has been a lifelong politician, and he's been trying to fight for people and their rights, and his sort of very charismatic element to himself and his political connections. And then of course we see the opposite side, the sort of underbelly of him that can't get away from sort of cheating sexually with his wife, who was pregnant with a child, and sort of that impulse that he has. So he is kind of like this big Greek hero that is, of course, real, and it's so great to see, because that we could have just seen sort of an outsider perspective, but because they were documenting his rise, they got access to so many things. We got real in-person interviews. We saw it happening as it was happening. And oftentimes they would say, everyone out of the room, everyone out of the room. But of course, the audience, the cameraman, we stay and we sort of get these sort of personal conversations. So it very much feels like that sort of just in the room. I can't believe, we were flying the wall, seeing these situations. A fascinating documentary, an interesting sort of man in terms of his rise and then of course his fall, but then also I think an interesting commentary on the political climate, especially in the States nowadays, where this becomes a media circus. This guy who's just running for New York mayor, which is a relatively prestigious role, of course it's blown up to national news. Now everybody thinks of him as, Anthony Weiner, the guy who shows his wiener and sends his wiener to girls across the country, kind of a thing. So it's also kind of a commentary on how how the media will latch onto the story and will totally destroy your life and mischaracterize you in so many ways just for that sort of click. Does he deserve it because he's doing these terrible acts? Is this the type of media we want that sort of highlights these stories and maybe not certain policies that are being passed that will actually impact people? It's an interesting sort of debate, and I think Weiner really goes on that balancing line and has this really entertaining kind of a slant to itself as well. So that's a great, in terms of political documentaries, that's one of my favorites. But another kind of pseudo-political documentary is my next pick and my final honorable mention, which is Winter on Fire. So instead of a political campaign, it's a revolution about the small sort of Ukrainian protests in Ukraine that ballooned up into essentially being a violent revolution. But the unique element to this, similar to Weiner, similar to Cartel Land, is we see the revolution from both a macro perspective, and they have, interviewing people after the event, but of course we see the actual events happening at the time, because nowadays everyone has a phone which has a camera in their pockets. So when you're on a revolution, we see people throwing Molotov cocktails. We're seeing people in the crowd actually seeing it, or we see people from buildings, zooming in and seeing the action. We have this really, and therefore it creates this very immersive feeling. And there's so much footage there, but the documentary is able to do is really craft this interesting narrative and use selective footage to make you really immersed into this kind of revolution and see how it starts from something small to something on a nationwide scale. It's also interesting, I think, on sort of a personal perspective of seeing just a modern European city and then seeing this large social unrest. Oftentimes we think of things like that, you maybe are thinking of World War II or the Russian Revolution or the French Revolution, things that still happened in the past 100 years ago, but seeing it now today in a modern context, there's still social unrest. There's still this sort of element that we have to be aware of, that people can strike on at any minute, and that can turn into a violent revolution very quickly. But it is just a fascinating, incredibly immersive, engaging documentary, because there's so many different angles of this revolution, seeing the effects, seeing how certain things lead to other things, and just getting that real life, interviewing people on the scene just as it happens from all these different sources to make you feel like you're in the actual case itself, the actual revolution itself. It's on Netflix. It's called Winter on Fire. It was nominated for a Best Documentary Oscar. I highly recommend it. Then going into my picks now, my 10th pick for the top 10 documentaries of the decade is In Jackson Heights.
Ese convencimiento de que queremos una mejor vida. Nosotros hemos venido a dejar aquí nuestras vidas, nuestro sudor, para que esta nación siga adelante. Debemos ser orgullosos de nosotros mismos y de nuestro trabajo y de todos nuestros países. Así es que en eso tenemos que trabajar, compañeros.
This is from legendary documentarian, back when documentarians weren't that legendary, Frederick Wiseman. He's done some great stuff going back to the 60s with Titicut Follies or High School, and he's known mostly for his sort of trademark as his analyzing and documenting institutions. So high school, of course, about high school. He's done hospitals before. He's done libraries, universities. With at Berkeley was this decade as well, and so was Ex Libris, New York Public Library, was also this decade. But I chose In Jackson Heights, and I think this is of the movies I've seen of his one of my favorites and one of his best, because while what it looks at is not just a sort of institution, a singular institution, but more largely the community. And this is known as one of the world's or America's most diverse communities in the world. And I actually think this will be a doc that stands the test of time, where we look at high school from the 60s. We can see how teenagers were different, but then also very much alike to teenagers today. I think In Jackson Heights will sort of be this snapshot of this community of New York at this time and some of the struggles that they faced, and that will sort of be maybe representative of the country at large. And the structure really is just sort of many different types of communities within the In Jackson Heights community, and we see their perspectives and just get to talk to them, because there is no overarching narrative. It's just sort of documenting the community and their struggles. And that's where it's actually kind of a genius format, especially for this kind of a story, because we get these almost mini movies within this movie. It's kind of a hard sell. It's like there's no narrative and it's 3 hours long. I have to watch this in one sitting. I did, but sort of going back and forth with breaks in between. But it is fascinating, because I think what's great about his documentaries is, especially his most successful one, is that every element, every storyline, we'll say, or every person that we interact with is interesting, and they bring their own case. We look at the Mexican community, and we look at the gay community in Jackson Heights. We look at the Jewish community. We look at small business owners, which I guess is sort of the largest storyline of going to small business owners and talking about, they always reference the gap that's going to come in and take them, and how they're sort of dealing with rent and how they have to sort of get together and fight for their rights. It brings sort of all these different people with unique perspectives and with unique challenges that in their lives, this is the biggest thing that's happening. But then, of course, when we get that perspective, then we go to the gay community, and they're trying to find a new place for them to have these weekly meetings and to support their community. And then, of course, the sort of immigration and Mexican community and Latino community that is in Jackson Heights, and they have these sort of really harrowing stories, a few of them, of crossing over the border, or sisters and family members who had to cross over the border, and just the challenges that they faced. And it's all these small little people with these fascinating stories and these fascinating perspectives that are the biggest things in their lives that define them, but then that's just a puzzle piece in this giant puzzle that's this community, and therefore this film. So in a way, saying it 3 hours, it's a long documentary. Yes, it's a long documentary, but it's also too short sometimes, because there's so many interesting people in this community, and what Frederick Wiseman chooses to keep it and to cut. I'm sure he's documented a bunch of people, but he found the most interesting ones. And that's just sort of the general standpoint. There's also just these smaller silhouettes almost that we get this perspective on, or we just talk to this person. One in an old age home where the woman's very sort of blunt and honest, speaking about how all of her friends have died and how she doesn't really want to live anymore, and not being she's really trying to not say it from a depressing kind of a viewpoint, and some people sort of criticize her on that, but she's really trying to say it on sort of just a humanist of just like, hey, this is what I'm going through perspective, which was better than some of the most thoughtful meditations on film of the decade that are trying to talk about death or anything. This was actually a real life encounter with it, which is just as you feel emotionally engaged with her, and you feel sort of bad for her, and you feel connected to her in a way, but also in an intellectual sort of thematic kind of a way. Just that sort of theme is brought and discussed, and you can think about. There's another sort of scene where there's no dialogue in the sense of the interviewing or anything like that. It's just we are watching these people work at a political office answering phones and seeing how they're sort of working with that customer service element and how they're struggling with that. I could go on for all these little vignettes that are going on throughout the movie. But it is these small storylines with real people and talking to real people and just seeing their everyday lives and seeing the challenges that they face creates this immensely entertaining, way more entertaining than I thought, but immensely interesting and really beautiful movie of this incredibly diverse community. That to think that there's all these different communities within this community, and they all sort of get together and represented by the overall banner of Jackson Heights. It's really terrific to see. Then my 9th pick is Faces, Places.
En fait, tu vois flou et t'es contente.
Et toi, tu vois tout foncé.
Et tu es content.
Arrête parce qu'elle essaie de me faire enlever les lunettes.
Un visage, c'est beau. Le but, c'est le pouvoir de l'imagination.
This is about the journey that co-directors, artist JR and director Agnes Varda have in their attempts to spread art and joy and life to communities throughout rural France, I guess is a way to sort of describe it. Essentially what these two characters do, of course real life people, Agnes Varda and JR, is that they go around to different communities, they take pictures of people and they create these, and they print them out at these really massively large kind of photos that they plaster and paste onto walls, sort of like a a giant mural, kind of an art project that they go throughout rural France in their sort of camera truck going along with. And I think Faces Places represents, at least on this list, the heartfelt documentary, that documentary that is just so fun to watch. And I think a lot of people, when they think of documentaries, it's super serious political or it's true crime and it's fascinating, it keeps on going and going. I think few people maybe forget about the really inspiring kind of heartfelt stories that go on. And I think that's a type of documentary that I want to shine light on, and Faces Places is maybe one of my most rewatched documentaries because it's not super deep and heavy and sort of, you have to be in the right mood for it. You're always in the mood for Faces Places because you can always sort of use that extra bump and that extra smile. It's a movie like in Jackson Heights that gains its pleasure and its experience from just interacting with everyday people. They, Agnes and JR often just talk to people and talk to having their pictures up on this giant wall or representing them and sort of and having art just using art and these pictures as a way to make them feel bigger than they are, or to really show that they go to a farmer and put his full body on the farmhouse just to sort of give him the large sort of overstanding respect that he has and is gained within the community. But really, that's one element of the film. The other film that makes it so delightful and just infectiously charming is the odd couple dynamic between Agnes and JR. They are the directors of the movie, but of course they're pretty much the main characters of the movie because they interact with the people and they're the ones printing it out. Printing out these giant pictures and deciding where they want to put them and going throughout and seeing where they go and where to put them and whatnot. But their interactions with each other, they often have these sort of conversations where Agnes wants JR to take off his glasses and he just sort of maybe likes to make fun of her for being short, and they have this really cute dynamic. And it's better than any sort of odd couple kind of a movie because it's not written, it's real, and they have sort of a real friendship, and you see that they care for her. And unfortunately, Agnes, she passed away a couple of years, last year, actually, 2019, almost a year ago, over a year ago now. And this was her last feature film, and it is sort of a great kind of a swan song because it's about her and how she's sort of losing. There's themes of her sort of, or not themes, but they talk about her losing her eyesight, and they sort of play with that later on near the end of the film. And how she talks about, she says, I've been thinking about death a lot, and how she just sort of wants to have these experiences and meet as many people as possible and keep on putting art into the world to the very last day she dies. And that's another element of the movie, is that it is not just sort of great and fluffy and sentimental and cheesy and surface level, that they do sort of have these real life conversations. And it's really, as much as it is talking to these people, working class people, and trying to create art and bring joy into their lives, it's also about a friendship and the highs and the lows, I guess, and then them laughing together, but then also, of course, getting serious with each other and wanting to learn more about each other. And Agnes oftentimes reflecting on her past life, because her early years when she was the age of JR, because she was a seminal director in the French New Wave. She directed Clear from 5 to 7 and married Jacques Demy, another famous French New Wave director. So she was heavily involved in that time period in terms of film history. She's super important. So to have this sort of film, making art right until the end of her death is really beautiful and heartwarming. And the movie is just an easy 90 minutes. It goes by faster than any documentary I've seen, and it's just a total blast and a great time. And it's on Netflix in certain regions, so I recommend you checking that out. Then my 8th pick is The Imposter.
The story's so bizarre, it's hard to believe it's true.
Him. Trust you in my home, you rascal, you. Yeah.
a great true crime documentary, and actually the only one left on my list. This is the sort of only one that I wanted to represent on the list, because personally I actually prefer the true crime documentary to be a format that is a mini-series, 8 episodes, something like that, because you're able to explore more and really get the details of the case. So movies like, of course, we have Tiger King that's just happening right now. I'm thinking of the Jinx or Making a Murderer. Similar way to Into the Abyss, it's not like a situation of who did what. It's a fascinating story. It's an interesting story that we sort of go on, but the story is revealed pretty quickly, because there's essentially, it's about a family who has a young child, their son, who disappears, and then 3 years later, he calls them back from Spain and says, I'm in Spain, come get me, essentially. But then when he comes back, he doesn't really look like the kid as he did before. And then, of course, we realize the son that we interview this imposter, and we realize that, he's not their son. He just wanted to get to this American family. But the interesting and the eerie element of it is, wait, this family is actually accepting him. So there's some interesting sort of questions from the imposter's perspective, the son's perspective, coming to this American family, just wanting to have sort of a better life, but also knowingly scamming these people and preying on their grief. But then the family's perspective of lying to yourself and trying to convince yourself and putting that sort of part of your life so away that when a solution finally comes, even if it's the wrong solution, you want it because it's a solution and you accept him. And even if you know in the back of your head that this is not your kid because he looks nothing like your kid, that he could be sort of a stand-in, and he could be that representation of your son, and that will be a way for you to grieve it. And is he preying on this family's grief, or is there actually something a little bit mysterious going on? Why are they allowing this guy to sort of come into their family? Do they have some sort of secrets? What happened to the kid actually? Did he really go disappearing? So they go down sort of this rabbit hole. But it's an interesting sort of it's a very interesting story and very fascinating. Even knowing that this happened, you wonder, wait, how did it happen? Why was he in Spain? How did he get here? How did he know about it? Why did the family? They talk to different members of the family. Some people are, of course, very convinced. Some people are very sort of hesitant. So there's a really interesting moral question going on within this very interesting story, and almost like a real life whodunit in the way it's just expertly crafted in the sequence of events, like a Hitchcock thriller. You always want to know what's happening. It's always suspenseful. It's always interesting. So just on that sense, it's an incredibly entertaining movie. It's also got this element of this sort of moral, larger question of grief and lying to yourself and exploitation and lots to do with lies and truth, and from both perspectives, both the son and then the family, and is that okay? Very interesting stuff to talk about. There is sort of another, I wouldn't say a true crime documentary, but another sort of interesting story kind of a documentary movie coming up next episode. If you've seen The Conners, you know what that's probably going to be, but it's in that similar sort of vein in terms of being very entertaining and very interesting. Then my 7th pick and the last movie we're going to be talking about in this video is Beware of Mr. Baker.
There's no myth about Ginger, he is exactly what he is. And that's the thing that we value. I love him.
What's wrong with that? Are you really going to hit me with the I f***ing well am. I'm going to f***ing put you in hospital.
A movie that feels very personal to me in the sense that I discovered it in the way that no one really recommended it to me. I was scrolling Netflix one day and I found it and I was like, okay, let's check this out. I've talked about before movies that you're able to find on your own that you have a real special connection to because no one told you to watch it, and therefore you feel sort of a personal ownership of that. And I think that I definitely had that sort of ownership with Beware of Mr. Baker, even though it was critically acclaimed in that sense. For some reason, I just never stumbled upon it, and I think it's really a great documentary. And because if you don't know, the story is about Ginger Baker, who is a sort of iconic figure without anyone really knowing about him in the 70s, in the 70s rock scene. where he was the drummer for Cream, and he also was the drummer for Blind Faith, and he was around all these sort of legendary figures and was a part of these bands with Eric Clapton and Steve Winwood, who would have these amazing careers. But then what happened to Ginger? And even within a lot of the rock and roll community, not a lot of people know what happened to him, and we learn, you know, more and more about him, but we hear it from the man himself. Turns out he went to Africa and really did a lot of music there, and now he's in South Africa, sort of living on his compound by himself, sort of in a very reclusive kind of a life. And the documentary succeeds because of Ginger Baker and his storytelling, and because it's called Beware of Mr. Baker, because he is an incredibly strange and mythological figure that when you talk to him, his myth just gets bigger and bigger. At times, he's incredibly enthusiastic and passionate and jovial, and will tell you about these great times, and then he'll immediately switch to rage, and he'll get incredibly angry at you, and he sort of oscillates between these two elements, where at one point he's great, and you love to be around him, and then at other points, we see the documentary trying to interview him, he just gets so frustrated and so mad, and goes back and forth with these figures. So just learning his story and using the film uses animation in a great way to sort of act out what he was experiencing. He's just an incredible storyteller himself, so we get that sort of great, just to know more about the 70s and that scene and being an actual rock star, to the path that led him down to being here. The film works because the animation does a great job to sort of tell the story, but it's because of Ginger Baker, because of how he tells the stories, because of how he's an elusive figure. Even though he's telling us his story, we know that it's true because of the details and because he was in these bands and whatnot, but the way he tells them is not only exciting, but it's also in times, you know, scary and intimidating, but it's electric, and it's so hard to believe, but then you're looking at the guy and he's telling you it, and you can sort of check the facts, and it's entertaining in that sense. So I have a personal connection to it because I found it myself. I'm also very interested in the 70s rock and roll. I love that kind of music. So then also seeing it so well done, just a total hats off to the filmmakers and getting able to talk to Ginger Baker and craft this great story and simultaneously explaining the myth but making the myth greater. It's a great sort of story and a great sort of figure, and a documentary is analyzing the great figures and great people and eclectic people in the world. Beware of Mr. Baker is one of those. So that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below, let me know some of your favorite documentaries, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a video. And you can check out my picks from 6 to 2, which are coming out next week and the week after that, a full video talking about my favorite documentary of the decade. That's about it, guys. Until next time, stay tuned.